So we're here to talk to you a little bit about scripting. So some of you may have been in Paul's session earlier in the week talking about some of the basics, and if not, great. But we want to take things a little bit further. We want to go beyond those basics, or beyond mortals, so to speak, and maybe learn about why I said awk, right? So if anybody here doesn't know me, I do recognize quite a few faces, but that's me. I've been with Jamf software for quite a while, and I enjoy scripting. Right? I enjoy scripting because it's efficient, and it lets me get a lot of stuff done pretty quickly. So I want to take a look very briefly about what we're going to be talking about, and I want to recap very quickly some basics about scripting, then get into some string manipulation, talk a little bit about some bash internals. That'll be useful for increasing efficiency and doing some debugging, and get into a few logical constructs, right, beyond the if-then, okay? So in the theme of Paul's presentation, standing on the shoulders of giants, I've stolen one of his slides. And this kind of talks about how we, or why we script, right? Laziness, impatience, and hubris. A lot of us joke about that kind of thing, but it's true to a certain degree. And I've kind of distilled this down into my own quote that if you've ever taken any of my classes, you've probably heard, which is, computers are designed to do repetitive tasks, therefore I should never have to, right? So that's the goal here. So taking a look at the basics, I'm going to look at a script structure. So the first thing we have is declaring our shell interpreter, often referred to as the shebang. Right? So that's basically saying, where's the interpreter that I'm going to use? What type of script is this? Right? So we're talking about bash scripts here. Of course, there's dozens of different scripting languages you can work with, but since bash is the default shell, that's kind of where I like to live, and from what I see in the environment, where a lot of people like to live. All right? Then we've got a command or commands. Right? Echo hello world, very simple, but it's the content of the script. And then finally, we can get into some exit status. Right? Now this exit status 0, for anybody who's not already aware of that, that means everything's okay. Right? The script ran fine, and we're going to move on. You can use custom exit status to mean something, right? To have some good error reporting in your scripts. Right? So using some number other than 0. Okay. So getting into string manipulation, the first thing most people learn is grep, right? So grep is going to allow you to return a portion of the output that is being fed, all right? And so the way I might feed it some output is with a pipe, all right? So the pipe is that vertical line character. On a US keyboard, you'll find that above the backslash. And what that does is it says, take the output from the command on the left and send it as the input to the command on the right. Okay, so here I'm saying, give me the information out of the diskutil or diskutility command line tool about my boot disk, and then I want to grep or return the line that contains the phrase free space. Right, so this was involved in building an extension attribute that would tell me, do I have enough free space to deploy a new secondary bootable partition? Okay. So we take a look. This is first the output of diskutil info slash by itself. Whole lot of information here. In fact, there's even more than we see in that window. And what I'm really after is right about the middle of this output, I've got volume free space, 222.5 gigabytes. So what I'm after is just the number of whole gigabytes to figure out if I've got enough space for this new partition. So the first step in that is running it with that grep free space, so then I just get that one line of output. Okay? So we're going to refine that a little bit more as we take a look at some other tools. All right. So now we've got cut. Right? So cut, kind of like it sounds, allows us to cut up pieces of that output that we've got. All right. So here, we've got a similar but slightly different scenario here. Here for a script, I was trying to return the volume name of the boot disk. right? Because I'm sure we've all encountered situations where people change the name of their disk, right? And if I'm calling for Macintosh HD and the disk isn't called Macintosh HD, then things don't work. So instead of calling for Macintosh HD, I want to know what the name is, okay? So that second, the command after the second pipe, cut, I've got a -D option there, and that's defining the delimiter, right? What's going to define what makes up the fields that I'm going to select from, okay? And so I've defined that delimiter as a space, right? So we've got the single quotes around the character that will be the delimiter, and so now that's going to be how I define my fields. Now -F tells me to return certain fields. And what I've got here is 19 dash, that means field 19 and everything that follows it, okay? And so this can take a little bit of trial and error sometimes to figure out exactly what field you're after, but typically output ends up being formatted very similarly, regardless of what disk you're looking at in this case, or regardless of whatever other piece of information you're looking at. It's typically going to be output in a very standard format. So this is going to give me the volume name on any disk I'm after. So here we are using grep to just pull out the line that contains volume name, and then adding that cut operation, I've pulled out simply Macintosh HD. All right. Now there's another option we can use with cut, and instead of defining fields, we can simply count characters, okay? So here, again, same example, but in my cut argument, I'm using the -C option, and I'm saying give me characters 30 to the end of the string. Okay, so that's what that dash means. As other options, I could define a range, say 1 through 6, or I could say -7, and that means everything up to 7. Okay. But in this case, I want character 30 onwards, and this gives me that same output, just another way of getting there. Okay. So now we've got awk, right? Awk is huge. There's an immense number of options you've got with awk. There have been multi-100-page volumes written about awk. We're going to take a look at a couple of options that are going to start us down a path to manipulating strings a little bit easier. Okay. So here, I've got awk print, right? So it's a little bit unusual syntax if you're not used to scripting, but there I'm saying, in single quotes, I want to print, and again, enclosed in the curly braces, field 3. Now, unless I've modified what that means with other more advanced tools, a field is a white space separated collection of characters. So let's see kind of what that means. All right, so here, I've got the beginning, or that first piece of the command, system profiler, right? So I'm getting that command line version of system profiler. I'm using grep to pull out the line that contains model identifier, right? And then in my second line, I'm using awk print $3, and that's returning me the third field from the previous output, right? So model would be $1, identifier colon would be $2, and MacBook Air 5,1 is $3, as we can see there. Okay. So that's a good way to pull out something when I know what the position is. Sed. This is another one that's enormous. Okay, so we're going to look at just a couple of very simple pieces. Sed stands for stream editor. Right, so stream is basically a stream of text that you're feeding it. All right, and one of the first things people want to take a look at when they're looking at sed is find and replace or substitution. Okay. So we've got a few options here. Right, so I'm using sed, and then in between my single quotes, I've got the S character, which says we're going to use that substitution function. Okay. And I'm looking for any instance in my stream, or in this case I use the word line, but in my stream of foo, and I'm going to replace it with bar. But if I use this syntax, it's only going to replace the first one, the first instance. Okay. Now maybe I want to replace not the first one. Maybe I want to replace the fourth one. So I can indicate which instance of foo I want to replace. Okay. Or maybe I want to replace all of them, right? Anytime I see foo, I'm going to replace it with bar, right? So that's going to use the G or global option. Okay. This is a good way to get your feet wet with sed. Now, talking a little bit about some bash internals, very, very useful one is debug mode. So when you've written a new script, I want to see exactly what it's doing step by step, even some of the stuff that I don't typically see on the screen or in my output, just to see where I might be running into some trouble. Okay, so a good way to get that done is instead of simply executing my script file, I'm going to use bash-x, right? And so it's telling me to show that extended or debug output. And so as an example here, I've got the set time server script from Jamf Nation, and I've run it with the -x. And as we can see, we're seeing each and everything that that script is doing. So it tries to set the time server. It wasn't given a value. It's comparing an empty value to an empty value. It's checking what version of the OS the script is running on, and using awk print again here. And we're actually getting a little bit more of an advanced option there, pulling out several fields. But we're getting our OS so we know which commands to run. And then we're, again, comparing some empty variables, which is then causing the error that we end up with. Right? Our parameter for time server is blank. We need to specify a time server. So if I was trying to run this for real to set my time server, well, now I know why it's not working. Okay? So bash has some built-in pieces that are going to allow us to manipulate some strings. So instead of going out to something like cut or set or awk, I can actually do it with some built-in variable functions. So here's an example. I've got a new script. And so I'm calling for the free space again. Right? I want to print that fourth field. And now, going back to that idea of the extension attribute to determine if I've got enough space for my new partition, I'm saying I want the disk-util info on my boot disk. I want the line that contains free space, and I want the fourth field from that line. Then I'm going to feed that into a variable called free. So this is another piece that is going to be very useful to fill a variable. I've defined my variable as being the results of this string of commands. Right? And that's what those backticks around my commands mean. So free equals the results of what's between the backticks. Okay? And for anybody who's not familiar with the backtick, that is, again, on a US keyboard beneath the tilde character, just above the tab key. And now the last bit, here where I'm actually stripping out characters, in my echo, and if you've ever built a script for an extension attribute, you'll recognize those result tags, right? To fill my extension attribute, I need to send my output to standard output wrapped in those result XML tags. But the bit in the middle is telling me return the variable free, but I want to identify the dot or the period character and omit it and everything else after it. Okay? So that percent is identifying the character I'm after, and then similar to, say, doing an ls command to list out directory contents, I can use that star as a wildcard saying everything else. So if we look at the output here, I can see step by step. Right, first I just pull out the free space line, and then I get field 4, so I've got 222.5. And because it's easier to deal with integers, and I don't really care about half a gigabyte when I'm trying to stat out a 10 gig partition, I'm going to pull out that decimal, round it down, and there, using that internal operator we just talked about, I get my 222 gigs. Okay. All right, so now in some cases, I might want to return only certain character ranges from a string. The example I'm looking at here is, this was a school that had their own internal service provider. They had GSX accounts, and they were trying to identify certain pieces of a serial number. Now, I'm not going to go into that level of nerdery here, but every character in a MAC serial number means something. And so they wanted those last 6 characters, okay? So here, using some stuff we looked at already, right? I'm defining the variable serial as being the results of System Profiler. Now this SP hardware data type, if you've never seen that before, that's simply telling System Profiler to only return one section of its output, the hardware section, okay? And now in my awk command, there's another new piece here, right? So instead of using grep, since I'm using awk anyhow, awk has a function very similar to grep. And so by defining a substring between those forward slashes, I'm getting effectively the same idea as what I would get from grep, right? So I'm saying return the line containing serial number and then give me field 4 from that line, okay? Now this is the bash internal piece. So again, I'm modifying the variable that I'm returning. So I want to get the serial variable, but I'm asking for characters 6 through 11, which is actually 7 through 12 because computers start at 0, okay? And so here's an example of that output. All right, so I run that first bit, I get this whole serial number, and then I return that variable with only characters 7 through 12, and I get the end piece that I'm looking for. Okay. All right, so I'm going to move on a little bit to some logic. And so Paul in his session talked about if, then, else, so I'm going to leave that one alone for this session. Encourage you to go take a look at that video once those are posted. But I want to get into a for loop. So this is a way to continue to iterate a task on multiple items. Okay, so this could be multi-line output from something that's being fed into the for loop. This could be the contents of a directory, which is actually something we're going to look at here. And essentially, we're defining for x, for whatever's in this pool of data. I'm going to do y, right? I want to do something, right? I can have a list of commands here. And then I close this out with done. I'm going to look at a more realistic example here. All right, so start out with my shebang. I'm defining a variable called script directory. I'm saying for logout script in script directory, so I'm basically listing the contents of script directory. I'm going to do logout script. I'm basically calling each script in that directory. Right, so now this was used in a situation where the administrator wanted to run a bunch of scripts locally. Right, so they would create this script directory, populate it with various scripts that needed to be run at logout, and that way, instead of constantly updating their logout script, they would just drop these script files in there, and they would all get run every time somebody logged out. Okay? So just looping through each item in that directory. So now I've got a case statement. Case statement is good if there's a finite set of possibilities that you're after. Okay? Now, a really good use for this, particularly if you're supporting multiple versions of Mac OS in your environments, is to identify which version the script is running on and then issue the appropriate commands. Right? So the binaries may change from version to version. There may be some added switches here and there. So I'm going to say case and expression. Now, this is what's known as a regular expression. This is not something we're going to get into in this session. We don't have time for that. We probably need a week or two. But this is basically I'm defining what I'm looking for. So in the example I'm about to put up, that's going to be what's the operating system, right? So in the cases of operating systems, and then I'm going to provide my patterns. So in this example, that would be the operating system. So I might say for what's your operating system, and then in, and pattern 1 might be 10.7, pattern 2 might be 10.8, so on. I'm going to have my statements, right? So what am I going to do in the instance of pattern 1? And then I'm going to end that case with a double semicolon. And then that lets me move on to the next case. Okay? And then I close out the whole thing with ESAC which is case backwards. Okay, kind of like the FI to close an if. All right. So I want to get a look at an example there. So here, I've got my shebang. I'm calling for the macOS 10 version, or sorry, filling a variable called macOS 10 version, using some of the things we've talked about so far, right? So I'm getting a command called sw_vers, or software version, feeding that to awk, pulling out the line that contains product version : printing field 2, and then cutting that up a little bit to only give me characters from 0 through 4. Okay? And here's my case. So for every instance in the macOS 10 version variable that is 10.7, I want to echo lion. For 10.8, I want to echo mountain lion. For 10.9, I want to echo mavericks. And then this asterisk or star allows me to indicate for anything else that I haven't defined, this is what I want to do. Right? This is an unsupported version of OS 10. Okay? So that's a case statement. And that's what I've got. And at this point, we're going to open up to Q&A. So, anybody? Yes. Have we got the mic? I'll just go ahead. I'll repeat your question.
So you were just saying, awk has a similar way to do what grep does, and that's simply just with the slashes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. So you can kind of simplify things, especially if you're already calling on awk. It doesn't make sense to add some more cycles to the process.
Okay.
Cool. Yes. So the question was, do I know any website that can do bash-specific regex? That I don't offhand. Sorry to say. If you meet up with me afterwards, we can kind of poke around a little bit maybe and see what we can find. Cool. Yes?
All right, so with the for loop, if you wanted to, let's say, list for the command for the for loop, let's say you wanted to list every file in a directory and then run a command on every file in that directory. If they're all no spaces, just hyphens or periods separating the names, it works great. How would you get, if the files have spaces in the names, it would try it on each one? How do you get rid of that issue?
So what you want to do is quote the variable.
You can just quote it and it
Yep.
will work? Okay.
So that's how you avoid a lot of those kind of things with special characters, spaces, that kind of thing.
Any other questions?
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. We're recording everything. These will be posted up on Jamf Nation after a while.
Is there any particular text editor you prefer to script in?
So, not really. Whatever you're comfortable with. Text Wrangler's nice. It's free. Text Edit, right? Ships with the Mac. Why not? Other text editors, like one of the benefits to something like Text Wrangler, if you're really into that nerdy aspect of text editing, BBEdit, which is kind of Text Wrangler's big brother. It does kind of cool things like highlighting or changing colors of the text while you have an open statement, so you know you need to close your quotes or your brackets.
I like Text Wrangler.
Also, a lot of people use Text Wrangler to ask questions.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. So the comment was a lot of people do use Text Wrangler. There's a big Text Wrangler community. So if that's your tool of choice, you've got folks you can talk to.
The next thing is just code coloring also, based on syntax or language, so it can change from shell to bash, etc., so on and so forth. And if you had code in C or Perl for some reason, you can change the language editor in text edit, and it'll color code based on your functions, commands, etc. So, in text Wrangler. So it's very nice, even if you're a beginner who's trying to see the advanced functions, you can kind of see what's the meat of what you're doing and what's not necessarily as important. The code coloring paint or whatever you choose.
So the,
It's free, like you said.
yep, so the comment there, just if anybody didn't hear, is another nice feature of Text Wrangler is you can choose different languages that you're working in, and it will recognize the syntax and color your text accordingly.
That's why I use it, because I'm a beginner.
Anybody else? Yes.
You pass this down.
So I'm actually a little new to bash scripting, but I have experience in the Windows world for scripting quite a bit. One of the things that was really hard, I guess, to figure out was, I guess bash has a lot of, like you just showed, a lot of special characters mean something, but it's really hard to Google search bash and like a backslash or a tilde or something like that. Do you know any good resources as a list of what all of those things are and what they mean and that sort of thing?
Yes, so actually Paul had mentioned in his session there's a couple of really good books by O'Reilly, but I tend to go to internet sources, bash.org, right? It's the group in charge of bash. They've got some good resources there. Yes, comment. Perfect, yeah, the comment was Wikipedia. As you would imagine, on a site like that, there's a lot of nerds, and there's some really good information about bash and other scripting languages up there.
I was just going to say the bash man page as well. Is a lot of
Absolutely, yep, bash man page. And for actually, if I can just define that term quickly for anybody who's not sure, man page is short for manual. So any command that you want to learn a little bit more about, if you type into the terminal man space and then your command, just about anything that you're after is going to give you the manual or the instructions. For anything that doesn't have a man page, say for example the Jamf binary, there's usually a -h or -help function.
There's a website that's ss64.com, and that website has language man pages for everything from Perl to regex to PowerShell to Bash to OSX, Darwin-specific Bash, etc. and so on. It's just a full list of man pages. You click the link for what you want after it gives you a description, and there's the man page. So if you kind of have an idea of what you're looking for, you could just use the find function and kind of find it and find the page you're looking for. If you need a simple resource that's super lightweight. Otherwise, you can go to all the nerd palaces that we've mentioned prior.
Cool.
It's ss64, the numbers 6 and 4.com.
Great resource.
Obviously, what we want to try and do is add a tab open or another window open for the man page, and then have a window open for the.
Yeah. I have an awesome trick for that. If you type in the command that you want to get the man page from and then right-click in your terminal, you'll actually see there's a little drop-down in there for open a man page, and it opens up a separate terminal window nicely colored, so you're not going to mistake it as another terminal window, and you can keep your man page there while you're working on your command. It's cool.
Awesome, thank you.
Anybody?
Anybody else?
Sorry.
Sorry, so I'm new to bash scripting as well. I saw that you had a single quote, double quote. Was that what was that you had before the single quote? Like whenever you're doing, what is it?
Backticks. So
Backtick.
to define the variable, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So to define a variable, you pick a name for it. So in one of these examples, I chose free for my free space. And so then I'm going to fill in free equals, and then the string of commands to get out my free space surrounded by backticks. Right. And so again, that's on a US keyboard at least, that's the same key as the tilde character, just above the tab key.
Sometimes it's called a grave key.
Right. Comment was sometimes that's called a grave key or a grave accent.
I do have one other, so I'll take my opportunity since I have the mic. I have one other book, if you're into books, that's a favorite resource of mine. It's the publisher is ROX, WROX, and the book is just called Beginning Unix. Wonderful resource. I think the best book out there, if you're into paper books.
Cool. Any other questions, comments? Oh, sorry. Yes.
Just to comment on shell scripting, Apple's got a very good primer in their developer library.
Oh, yes, absolutely. So the Apple Developer Library, and actually you'll find a lot of similar information there as you would on the SS64 site that was mentioned earlier. But of course, it's going to be much more Apple focused.
I noticed on your the free disk syntax is different than the volume syntax with the spaces between the slash and grep and awk and the pipe. Does that matter?
Generally not. Unless it's part of a string, usually spaces are ignored. So for example, sometimes I'll put spaces around a pipe. It's not going to hurt anything. And that's just for ease of readability.
So as you mentioned, there's different commands as the OS changes 10.6 to 10.7 to 10.8. Is there somewhere that explains what's changed from OS to OS so that when you get to 10.9, you know what you've got scripted, so it's going to screw up?
Generally, I haven't really seen too much. I mean, if you're part of the developer program, you can get a look at those documents and before a new release comes out and get a chance to test things on it before it actually hits production. But like in most things, Apple doesn't always tell us what they're doing until they do it. Yeah. Right, so when a binary is updated, the man page is typically updated. So the best advice I'd have there is to be a member of the developer program, test any of your mission critical scripts in the new version as the betas are released.
What's some of the best practices to make a script look pretty? You know, when I've started scripting, it's, you know, return, 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 everything's all lined up, and then you go on Jamf Nation and someone's got nice tabs. Mm-hmm. Are they tabs, spaces? What's some of the best practices there?
Generally, so for example, some of the formatting I used in our examples here, if I am defining, say, my cases in a case statement, keep those all tabbed over to one side so they all line up together, and it's easy to visually see what I'm trying to get done there. Another good thing is document your scripts. So I know Paul talked about this a little bit in his session. In a bash script, anything that follows that pound sign or the hashtag is a comment and will be ignored by the interpreter. So just throw those in wherever they make sense, right? I might say, this is where I'm defining the OS version, right? And then I might later on say, well, this is where I'm going to output my unrecognized version information. Cool.
What I suggested that I find it better to use it's better to use a GUI-based text editor when you're trying to do that, because a lot of them have the features built in that'll automatically handle your spacing for you to make it easier to do your syntax.
Sure. Yep, up and then back again.
If you're writing a script that's complicated or long, don't comment it for you, comment it for me if I have to take your job later. Like, no, but for code maintainers later or people that work with you that have to open the script and read it, you might know what the 15 lines are saying, but they might look at it like it just threw up on them. So you want to definitely label out, this is what this section is doing, this is what this section is doing, and then if Apple changes the binary in a release, well, then clearly I just have to change something in this area, and you'll not have to remember which script you wrote, what year, and fix the problem. So write it for code maintaining purposes, not for just you or, hey, I did this here real quick. Write it for, what is this doing here? It'll also help you if you share out on Jamf Nation, because everyone will see that, whether their skill level is 0 or 100, and it's very difficult to understand sometimes. So.
Mm-hmm.
And along with that, use the scripted variables. So if you have
if you have lots of variables, make sure that they're as descriptive as possible so that when somebody's coming behind after you, they can understand what you were trying to do.
Yeah, so it may seem annoying when you're writing a script to have a long variable name, but it'll probably benefit you in the end.
If I can just piggyback on that comment, my apologies to any developers in the room, but developers have a tendency to say, hey man, all my stuff is in the code. But definitely a best practice is to add comments. I'm not a developer, I don't write code, but I do write scripts. And add comments, add comments, add comments. Make as many as you need.
Mm-hmm. We have a question here. Oh yeah, up in the back.
Do you have any strategies for outputting to a log and then in that log, in line, having a date and time? You know, like when you're outputting to a log, you want to kind of see the progress and then including the date stamp there.
There is a date command in Bash that simply outputs the date, so you can make that part of assembling your output string. Sure. So as I'm basically defining my output, as I'm saying, well, I want to grab the free space, for example, I could return the free space variable and then the date, or vice versa, whichever I prefer. Does that make sense?
There's also the logger command, which writes the syslog with timestamp, just whatever you put after it, whatever text.
So the comment was there's the logger command as well, which will output to the syslog.
There's like 9 ways to do everything.
Exactly, yep. So the comment here.
Suits you the best. I mean, if you take that and you could grep the line up twice, make 2 separate commands, grep the date, and make a space, then make a new line below it too. It all just depends on what works for you.
Yeah. So again, yeah, the comment here, there are dozens of ways to skin the proverbial cat. So there's generally not one right answer. There might be a dozen right answers.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things I've done is made a curl request to Google's forum. So that basically all the machines out there are logged into a central spreadsheet, and you can then go and look for that spreadsheet and see those specific cases where machines are not functioning the way you want them and target them.
Oh, that sounds great. So yeah, for anybody who's not familiar with that command, curl allows you to interact with URLs, and so you can use that to read from or send data to a URL. Well, then you can't read the URL. So the question was, what happens when you're not online? Yep. So you'd want to set up maybe a case statement or something like that saying, well, if I get this error, then say, hey, you're not online.
Miles, do you want to talk about test environments maybe a little bit, about setting those up? Like, do you set up a computer just for testing your scripts? What's your strategy for testing?
As far as testing, so let's say I've got 3 operating systems involved in my environment, 10.7, 10.8, and I'm working on this future thing, 10.9. I would probably either have a piece of hardware or a virtual machine, pretty much set up the way I was intending to set these things up in production. Right. So not really too much I would build there as far as a test environment, just have something that looks like what you're deploying.
Since we're off topic on test machines, what are good strategies for setting up a virtual machine? What are the rules with Apple and stuff like that? Can you run a Mac on a Windows platform, or do you have to have Mac on Mac, and what are things like that?
So the terms and conditions, as I recall them offhand, and I'm going to, of course, defer to the documents, are that you can virtualize OS X, but it must be done on Apple hardware. And I recall reading something to the effect of you can have 2 virtual machines per piece of Apple hardware. So That's the terms and conditions. You'll find comments online that say other things, and maybe certain things are possible outside the terms and conditions, but I certainly wouldn't recommend going outside those terms and conditions.
Naming conventions for your scripts. Do you have some sort of a theory? I don't know, some sort of a naming convention for if it's OS specific, if it's application specific, something of that nature to kind of keep them organized?
Mm-hmm. So in general, and I use this with any file name packages, for example, I want to remember that this is 2013, right? I'm not working in 1977. I'm not restricted to 8 characters. Use characters. Make long file names. Be as descriptive as possible. And that's kind of the best tip I can give you. Within that, use whatever makes sense to you. Right? So I might say set time server 10.7, 10.8, 10.9 as an example file name for my script. But just use characters, right? Be as descriptive as possible. You're going to thank yourself later. And certainly, as related to the comment earlier, your colleagues or the people who follow you in that job are going to thank you later.
On topic, when you're doing things like system profile or something like that, and you're trying to get like the model or something like that, how would you know between the different OS versions that it's always going to be the 4th field or something like that you're after?
Test, test, test. Right? Do it, see where it lives. Right?
You mentioned earlier when you don't exit 0 or you don't have a clean exit, you can exit with other codes to do other things.
Mm-hmm.
I seem to remember probably the self-service class yesterday, and I won't call anyone out today. But is it like Cocoa dialog that you'd use, or you could like set up separate cases based on exit statuses to give you separate situations, or do you have a certain situation that like you can think of where you typically use a different exit than 0? Not that I don't, I'm just wondering, maybe it would probably help everyone else because it was brought up.
Sure. Not really thinking of one off the top of my head, but you can do pretty much anything with that exit status. That becomes a variable that you can read. And so I might, let's say in the example, the curl that came up earlier, I might decide that exit 14 means that we weren't able to connect to the network. And that might kick off some other script that tries to connect to the network.
This is kind of silly, but it was actually the best advice I ever got. Never script alone.
It's good advice, right? You want to sanity check your code. Right. Jamf Nation's a great place to not script alone. All right. We got a couple more minutes here if there's any other questions. I will, after this session, hang out one flight down in the big classroom if anybody's got any other questions they want to bring up outside this format. But thank you all for coming.
Cool. Thank you, guys. And then also, thank you. Nice, Lacey.